and thank you all for being here. Those of you who are here this morning will know we got off to a great start with presentations by both our presidents and a wonderful discussion led by two student leaders of ways in which we might deepen our collaboration as institutions. And that particular discussion is a great bridge to the session this afternoon, the first of two, as our topic is higher education in a global era. And we're all agreed up here on the panel that we want to leave lots of time for discussion, especially with students. This is really a wide-ranging topic, and it's a nice topic in that it links our overall theme of the future of the Asia-Pacific and U.S.-Japanese relations back to our work as members of university communities in our respective countries. So I'm delighted to be able to lead the discussion. And in a second, I will introduce our colleagues, two from Georgetown, two from Sophia, but just a few introductory remarks about the theme, which, as I suggested, is very wide-ranging. We don't want to discipline the discussion too much, but a little bit of a framework might be helpful. One way to think about higher education in a global era is to think about internationalization. This is that familiar process, which one can trace back decades now, it's accelerated since then, of more and more interaction across borders as scholars and students move from country to country, as ideas and practices are also shared. And that'll be one of the themes we'll look at today. But another fascinating topic is the way in which universities are emerging as actors in their own right, in what we might call a nascent global civil society. That is to say, universities are competing for the best students, they're cooperating in areas of teaching and research. Georgetown and Sophia are a good example of that. But they're also facing up to and helping to inform our best efforts to grapple with a whole range of global policy issues, issues of human rights, issues of science and technology that we'll look at a little bit later, issues of economic and social development. And universities are contributing to those debates and to efforts to address those global challenges, both directly and indirectly. Indirectly, I suppose, and most pertinent to the concerns of our students, we're trying our best to prepare citizens and leaders for this global era, to be part of efforts to address these global challenges, whether they go into business, civil service, or into other areas. But there's another way in which we address those challenges through convening, as we are today, experts around these issues, especially universities as blessed as Georgetown and Sophia to be in capital cities, have a great opportunity to convene thought leaders and experts from government, from academia, and other sectors to explore some of these global challenges and really be a source of knowledge and contribute to solutions. So those are a couple of ideas or ways we can think about the role of higher education in a wider world. And as we narrow in on our panel and some of the more specific questions we've looked at, I want to raise three that we generated early on in our conversations about what we'd be doing. Three broad questions, but I think that get at some more specific issues we'll want to touch on this afternoon. The first question we raised for discussion, how should we incorporate globalization, intercultural exchange, and international experience more fully into higher education in Japan and the United States? The second point links back to the global challenges I just mentioned. The question there, how can Japan and the United States cooperate for the advancement of education in support of human development in both countries and around the world? And third, and just as important, and perhaps the overarching question, how can Georgetown and Sophia promote Jesuit values as part of their wider educational mission? So keep those questions in mind, and rather than go through those questions in a systematic way, we all agreed it made more sense for each of the panelists to address some angle, to pick out some themes, maybe be provocative, help to frame a conversation related to these wider themes. They're each going to speak for 8, maybe 10 minutes max, which will allow for some time for a conversation here on stage before we open things up. And we'll have at least a half hour, I hope more, to hear your questions, your comments and ideas. Again, that'll be a wonderful opportunity to hear from our students in particular. So brief introductions of our panelists before we get started. To my far left, my colleague Kevin Doak, who is a professor and Nippon Foundation Endowed Chair in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures. He's known to many of you here as a specialist in the study of nationalism, democratic thought, and culture in modern Japan, the author of many acclaimed books. I'll just mention one, Dreams of Difference, The Japan Romantic School and the Crisis of Modernity, which he published in 1994. Next to Kevin, Kosaku Yoshino, professor of sociology at Sophia, and longtime friend and colleague to Kevin. They're an example of how Georgetown and Sophia are closely bound together. He specializes, you can agree with me or not, he specializes in issues of nationalism and globalization in Japan and Southeast Asia. And among his publications, I'd mention Cultural Nationalism in Contemporary Japan, the Sociological Inquiry. Next to Kosaku, we have Taro Komatsu, a professor in the Department of Education and the Faculty of Human Sciences at Sophia. His research and publications focus on education policy and administration in developing nations and post-conflict societies. And before coming to Sophia, he worked as an education specialist for UNESCO. And finally, my colleague and friend Marilyn McMorrow, a sister in the Society of the Sacred Heart, and a professor here in our School of Foreign Service. She's an expert on normative and political theory of international relations, has written widely on human rights, poverty alleviation, and just war theory, among other topics. So colleagues, thank you for joining. We look forward to the conversation. And Kevin, why don't you get us started?
Okay, thank you, Tom. The 19th century American essayist and humorist, Samuel Clemens, known to most people as Mark Twain, is famous for reportedly having said, "Reports of my death are vastly exaggerated." And I think you can say something similar about reports of the demise of US-Japan cultural and educational exchange. We hear oftentimes people saying, well, nobody goes to Japan anymore. Japanese won't leave their country. We hear about Sakoku paradise, the idea that Japan is a wonderful place and nobody wants to leave. I think those reports, however, are exaggerated. And the first thing that I wanted to do today is place the question of US-Japan educational exchange, and particularly the relations that we have with Sophia, and Sophia has with Georgetown, within the context of I think, renovation, a resurgence of renewed interest in US-Japanese educational exchange. And my source for that is a report that came out just this year earlier called the Kulkan Report, or the formal title is the United States-Japan Conference on Cultural and Educational Interchange, whose educational task force prepared this report, and it has some fascinating and interesting recommendations, suggestions for how US-Japan singularly or collectively can remove barriers and provide encouragement and resources for this renewed moment in US-Japan cultural educational exchange. So in a sense, this fits within the broader framework that Prime Minister Abe has called Japan is back. And I think Japan is very much back. It's a long report. I would be happy if anybody contacts me to give you the report. You can read it on your own. I don't have enough time here. Our time is very short. But there's one point that I want to pull out of it that I think is particularly relevant to Sophia and to Georgetown's exchanges. Actions for Japan, number 3, encourage a liberal arts education for better training of global citizens. I think that captures pretty much the main templates of what we've been talking about here. And what I'd like to do in the remaining few minutes I have is give a sense not only about my optimism of the quantity of US-Japan educational exchange that we can foresee growing in the future, but more the trickier problem that those of us in the humanities like to deal with, and that is, what is this all about? What is liberal arts? What should we expect of it? And the second sticky problem is, what is global? And how do you differentiate global from international? And I think it's very important that we try to do that. So I'm going to preface my remarks by telling you everything I say henceforth is not my own ideas. They're those of a Japanese who was writing them in 1937, who later became Minister of Education, Chief Justice of the Japanese Supreme Court, and a justice at The Hague. He sounds like the right kind of guy for the things that we're dealing with. It was Tanaka Kotaro, who was also, of course, Catholic. And so his values of what was global and what was liberal arts I think, resonate with the kinds of questions we raise at Georgetown, and I hope at Jochi or Sophia as well. His first question was, what do we mean by liberal arts? And for him, the Japanese word he's using is kyoyo, which I think is a good translation for liberal arts. So liberal arts has to do with culture. What do we mean by culture? And he said the problem with culture is there are different ways of understanding it, and I think those ways are still with us today. One understanding of culture has a national implication. Japanese culture, Chinese culture, American culture. So the other way of thinking about culture in the 1930s, and to some degree is still with us today, is an expansive notion of culture that can become quite imperialistic. In fact, as he was writing, the Japanese state was setting up an international cultural movement to take Japanese culture abroad to promote the interests of the state. So Tanaka's question, and I would pose this as a question for us today, is when we try to learn about culture, can we avoid what he would call the two extremes of culture either serving an ethnic national identity, which is very unhealthy, or the political state and its expansiveness, which can be very unhealthy. And how do we avoid those? Tanaka gave a lot of deep thought to this problem, and his conclusion was that we need to perceive deeper beyond the forms of culture, and I would say beyond the forms of internationalism, to the very values that underlie that liberal arts is trying to articulate and to implant. He said very powerfully, and I think he's right, that the goal of liberal arts is to raise the dignity of the person. How does it do that? Because it can also damage the dignity of a person if it's done poorly. And there is the reason that I think liberal arts education, or cultural education, is so important. Tanaka situated his own response to those values between two other extremes. One, he said, was the notion of what we would call today, perhaps, or what Pope Emeritus Benedict called the dictatorship of relativism, what he called libertarianism, which is simply to say, we don't know what cultural values are important, so we will just engage in a relationship and hopefully we'll stumble on them. Of course, we might stumble on the wrong ones too. But in addition, he said there's another problem, and that was that some people had a very restricted understanding of what those values were and that they were a part of cultural imperialism. So if you have an idea of what culture is, at that time, it seemed like it was promoting your own nation, or you backed away from promoting your own nation and you fell into a kind of depressive, decadent notion that there's no way to understand what these cultural values are, and the best thing you can do is play. Tanaka suggested a middle way. And the middle way was to suggest that there are some truths that we can understand as human beings. And it was deeply connected with his notion of globalism as an alternative to internationalism. Briefly, by the way, Tanaka was a scholar of law, so when he talks about internationalism, he said, international law is not the hope for justice, it's the tool of the powerful. It's a body of treaties concocted by powerful states at the expense of the weak states. In a similar vein, internationalism can become a cultural analog to that, and we must be very careful not to allow it to fall into that. So he proposed against international law what he called global law, sekai ho. And we talked a little bit last night at Senator Daschle's talk about maritime law. Maritime law is one of the places where we're finding the reality of this global law today. So it's not simply a myth. What I'm wondering is how we can then take from Tanaka's notion of global law a lesson about culture, global culture as distinctive from international culture. Global culture is a culture in which humanities, which is not defined by a nation, not defined by a region, but defined on the basis of tried and tested notions of what is enduring and what is true. Now, how can we find those notions? Tanaka, as a Catholic, had a very simple answer: revealed truth through the Catholic Church. Now, many of you at Sophia know, but I'm not sure how many of our American friends know, that that's probably not a very strong foundation for liberal arts education at Sophia because so few of the students and the faculty are Catholic. We might say something similar about that at Georgetown, but we can leave that for the discussion. Then how can you find a way of articulating what Tanaka believed were the true values of the Catholic Church in a culture where so few people accept those values? And his solution, and I think it's a good one for us to think about, was what he called natural law. Because he pointed out natural law is not a theological abstract construct that comes only from medieval Christians, As a commercial lawyer, an expert in commercial law, Tanaka argued, natural law is the very human process that takes place when two people of different backgrounds meet and exchange goods. How do they know the other side will honor that treaty or that contract? How do they know that when they turn over the furs, the person won't run away with the silver? And he said, you know because you can trust human beings because there's something in all human beings that recognizes certain things as true and good. It doesn't take a Christian to recognize that incest or murder or stealing is wrong. And so from that foundation, Tanaka began to build a very powerful theory of global law. And what I'm suggesting is that we might think of this as a groundwork for building a culture of global liberal arts. Now, I was asked to say something about Jesuit values, and what I would say is this. Jesuit values are inalienable from Catholic values. It doesn't make any sense to try to talk about Jesuit values without talking about Catholic values. And it probably doesn't make any sense to talk about Catholic values in terms of intercultural exchange without talking about something analogous to natural law. So what we have to figure out in a day in which the higher education system around the world has become awash with what Pope Emeritus Benedict called the culture of relativism is a way in which we can stand up, as Tanaka did, for values that are not relativistic, that are not lost in some open-ended game of searching without ever finding, but that can locate eternally true and good things and help bring those things out, and through them discipline and create and form a new generation of students and people and citizens and global citizens especially who can carry those values out and make the world a better place. Thank you very much.
Applaud each of our speakers, okay? Please. Kosaku.
Yeah, good afternoon. It appears that we are discussing on the assumption that students desire globalization, intercultural understanding, and international relations. But is this a valid assumption? I have got a rather gloomy view of this in light of Japanese students today. Let me first share with you one episode that happened to me and my students fairly recently. Now, I've got one student who was a member of the NGO who was helping street children in developing countries. And this student gave a presentation in my class. And of course, it was a very lofty deed indeed. And I was certainly anticipating big applause from the rest of the class. But after the presentation, this student got a rather negative view from the rest of the class. And they said, why do you, as a Japanese, have to go to these developing countries to help their children when we have so many problems in Japan? See, I didn't have any words. I was at a loss what to say. I was shocked, and so was my student. And after a number of similar experiences, I have come to form an opinion that Japanese students these days have become inward-looking, conservative, and even nationalistic compared to students 2 years ago. And this, in fact, is supported by some of the statistics as well as my own interviews with university students. Look, I'm trying to be provocative, and you should criticize me, later. In fact, the number of Japanese students studying abroad has been declining since 2007, as has been widely reported in the media in recent years. Now, What is interesting and what is quite ironic is that the critical and nationalistic response came from the type of students who had international experiences, such as kikoku shijo, or returnees, or children of Japanese expatriates who took part of their education outside of Japan, and also students who experienced living overseas in the form of a short study abroad or a Lonely Planet kind of a traveling for 2 months or 3 months. And this made me reflect a number of sociological questions. Firstly, how do we sociologically explain a change in young people's orientations? This question is very interesting, but it's not so relevant to the theme of our session. And perhaps a more pertinent question will be, what kind of international experiences can bring about more global awareness among Japanese students? Now, short studies abroad for, say, language courses or summer sessions are becoming very popular, even at Sophia University. And exchange programs for 6 months are also becoming popular. But I think I'm talking about the length of study abroad. A short study abroad can be counterproductive from the point of view of intercultural experience. If you are a PhD student in anthropology, of course you have to go to a field. You have to go to field work to distant villages or islands, and before you go for field work, your supervisor will tell you, you will go to this island, and as soon as you arrive, you will start interviewing villagers there, and they will tell you this and that. And if you stay there for 3 months, you think you have, understood the mentality of the villagers there. But if you live there for 6 months or 1 year or 2 years, you begin to realize that what they actually do is very different from what they say they do. So your supervisor will tell you there is a clear distinction between, you've got to make a clear distinction between ideal patterns of behavior and actual patterns of behavior. And quite often when we do a comparative culture, and we don't compare cultures, but we contrast cultures, probably because we are in another country for too short a period of time. If you come to the United States, Americans will surely tell you, well, Americans are very individualistic, whereas you Japanese are very group-oriented. But aren't we contrasting the ideal patterns of American culture and ideal patterns of Japanese culture? Aren't we contrasting individualism? Of course, individualism is the ideal of the United States of America. It is even enshrined in your constitution, right? And then you tend to contrast individualism as the ideal of the United States of America and groupism or collectivism, which is an ideal of the Japanese. So what you really should be doing is to compare cultures and not contrast cultures. That is my first point. Secondly, which is related to the first point, my first point, I would like students to experience at least 3 countries, including their own, so as to avoid a two-way contrast and to be able to compare. A Japanese encounter with the United States often ends up contrasting supposedly peculiar Japanese with supposedly universalistic Americans. He or she has to go on, experience another culture in Asia or in Europe to be able to really compare, which is my second point. Thirdly, I want to say, let us be hubs for onward journeys and not destinations. What I mean by this is that for a long time, international migration of students has tended to be regarded in dichotomous terms. That is, one's country of origin and one's destination. A student goes from country A to country B and comes back to country A. But with increasing globalization, we should pay more attention to a continuing flow of migrating students. A student does not simply go to a particular country and returns to where he or she comes from, but quite often moves on to further destinations, which is a very normal thing and healthy thing for any ambitious student to do. Now, successful countries are successful in obtaining overseas students have always been hubs. The United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia, they have always been hubs. Asian students come to the United States and get a master's degree, and then many of them go on to the UK or Australia for PhDs and so forth. And unfortunately, most Japanese students are left out of this network of English-speaking countries, and therefore many of the Japanese universities cannot become hubs for this. But fortunately, Sophia University is a bilingual university, so I would like American students, Georgetown students, to use Sophia University as a hub, and then use Japan as a hub, and then you can go on to China or Southeast Asia or the Middle East or Russia or Africa and so forth. So we're quite happy to serve as a hub for anybody interested in that. Gee, I didn't come here to publicize about my university. Finally, I've been asked to say something about Jesuit values and globalization of higher education. And I don't think I really qualify to comment on Jesuit values in front of Professor Koso. But this is what I heard from a Catholic colleague of mine. And he said that Kosaku, Jesuit values is this. Jesuits try to be embedded in different cultures, and there they produce flowers by immersing themselves in different cultures and so forth. Likewise, Sadako Ogata, a former United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, said, "Go to the field, see it for yourself. Do not start imagining how others might be feeling. Go to the field and see for yourself how they are feeling." And I think ignorance is, don't be ignorant, because ignorance breeds fear, and fear breeds hatred. Experience breeds confidence, and confidence breeds hope. Thank you.
Taro?
Okay.
Yes.
So my name is Taro Komatsu, faculty member of Sophia. I had a class after lunch during last semester, and I always call it sleepy time. Not sleeping time, but sleepy time. I hope you are awake. I think I have to change a bit, shift a bit the tone of discussion, focusing more on the role of universities in the advancement of global human development. Here I mean to discuss human development in low-income nations and how we can cooperate to promote it through the training of university students in Japan, US. Currently, US is by far the largest foreign aid donor, I think spending about 30 billion US dollars a year. In Japan, largest donor in 1990s, was the fourth in 2012, as I remember. But still one of the major development aid agencies. And both countries are major economies, so we share the responsibility of helping less resourced nations to overcome poverty and promote development. Now, human development is one of our key themes here today. And human development, as discussed in the context of international development, is about enlarging human choices so that people can lead their lives as they wish. And education is one of the most effective tools to promote human development. The world has seen much progress in providing children with basic education, with access to basic education, but still some 60 million children are out of schools. A concern for the world poverty and lack of opportunities, learning opportunities, has been expressed by Father Adolfo Nicolas. I also have to say that I'm not really qualified to really talk about the Jesus values in front of the distinguished guests. But anyway, the Father Nicolas, the Superior General of the Society of Jesus, in his speech addressing to Sophia students in 2008, he talked about the poverty as a social challenge, and he also talked about lack of education access to children as a cultural challenge. And these challenges are two of the four challenges that he lays out, challenges that have to be tackled by the society. So in this sense, Sophia and Georgetown, two universities sharing fundamental values, have every reason to be a part of the world's efforts to improve the lives of people and by improving human development. So how can universities tackle these challenges? Universities can contribute to human development through research and outreach activities. But in line with the spirit of this panel, I'd like to focus on universities' role in teaching. In particular, training the next generation of practitioners and scholars engaged in the advancement of global human development. I believe we can accomplish such an important task by working together. Just recently, I participated in an online discussion forum launched by the International Network of Education Emergencies, where scholars from around the world, they exchanged views on how we can engage university students in a discussion around education in post-conflict, post-natural disaster areas. We shared the teaching syllabus. We also shared learning resources. So this is one example of international collaboration as a way to advance international education. But of course, the real changes occur when we are actually engaged in teaching. Here, Japanese and US students should be provided with opportunities to work together and discuss and find ways to improve global human development. Such a joint work can not only help students deepen the understanding of issues around human development, but also increase mutual understanding between US and Japanese students. It is critical that they learn how to work together because when they start working in development agencies or whatever agencies dealing with global issues, they will have to work with their global partners. One idea I am exploring is to organize a joint study trip to a place where poverty is acute and many children do not have access to education. They can see and feel firsthand the realities of such global problems. Professor Yoshino referred to the importance of knowing about realities in the field. In fact, Father Nicolas, he also mentioned in his speech about that importance. He encouraged young people to know poverty before know about poverty from books, stressing the importance of the real experience. In the field, both US and Japanese students may pose questions to themselves. What kind of education do children in developing countries receive? They will be propelled to think deeply about the role of education beyond access. Do education adequately prepare children in developing nations to be productively engaged in economic activities? Does it equip pupils and students with the skills and attitude to live peacefully with others? Or does it reproduce inequalities and, worse, exacerbate hatred? These are serious questions, and students may reflect on their own educational experience. Of course, our joint efforts as such requires institutional infrastructure. In my Department of Education, my colleagues and I are preparing a new seminar dealing with human development, and the course will be conducted in English. Throughout Japan, or maybe in the US as well, departments of education tend to focus on domestic education because it's a big issue. As far as I know, Georgetown does not have a school of education. Maybe not.
We have a minor.
Minor, right. But Sophia's Department of Education, Sophia, is unique in that sense that 4 out of 8 faculties have some interest in the international dimension of education. In any case, in this seminar, students will become familiar with some key terms in English that I hope will enable them to be able to discuss and debate human development in the international arena. We'll be happy to broaden seminar discussion beyond the classroom wall and work with the students in US universities, including Georgetown. And I'm hoping that this symposium serves as a catalyst for the development of our joint projects. Thank you.
I usually talk about international relations, human rights, and human development, but for some reason today I want to reflect more on the founding story of Sophia and the founding story of Georgetown. The question I'm using as my basis is, how do Georgetown and Sophia promote Jesuit values as part of their educational mission? And I stepped back to say, how did Sophia and Georgetown get to be places that thought that that's what they were supposed to be doing? And I know why that question caught me. It's because I not only teach at a Jesuit university, but I'm a member of a Catholic women's religious order that's based on the Jesuit approach. My order founded a sister university to yours, Seishin, in Tokyo. Seishin Daikakyo, is that right? So, and one thing about religious orders is they all have a founding impetus. We tend to call it charism. It's a technical term, and I think it means what our motivation is when you start a religious order. And then when that religious order starts an educational institution, somehow the charism shapes the educational institution, but after a while, the educational institution, which of course has a life community of its own, begins to shape the charism of the order. And that's what I really wanted to talk about today. Your founding story, Georgetown's founding story, and what that has positioned us to do in the future. There's an expression I agree with that says that a Catholic university ought to be a place where the church does its thinking. Fine. Some might want to advocate that the Catholic university also ought to be the place, or a central place, where the church does its teaching. Today, I'm asking us to think about how the Catholic university can be a place where the church does its learning. For example, Catholic universities often put a premium on researching and teaching theology and philosophy, and I really enjoyed reading the course descriptions of the religion courses at Sophia. But how could any university research, develop, and teach theology or even philosophy well, apart from those disciplines being informed by developments in cosmology, the natural sciences, major shifts in human understandings about politics and gender, or since 1948, the worldwide turn to human rights as our common moral language? So I would like to suggest that whether any particular Catholic university chooses to focus its mission on what the church is teaching versus what the church is learning and wants to learn may well follow from the particular charism of the religious order that founded it. And I definitely think that's true in the case of Sophia. And I'm looking at your founding story on your website and also what Father Chancellor Kozo shared last night. So that in Xavier, Francis Xavier, you have this young Catholic missionary from Spain. He wanted to set the world on fire. He is only 25 when he's at the University of Paris. There he meets Ignatius. He becomes, with Ignatius, the founder of this new religious order. By the time he's 35, which I still think of as young, he's already in India. He's already in India. By the time the Society of Jesus is 7 years old, it's already intrinsically international. Now that has to shape the kinds of educational institutions the order would found. And so we know too that the early Jesuits were impelled by describing their charism that God was present in all things, in all times, all fields of research and discovery, all cultures, all histories, all forms of religious reverence, not to mention in each person, that God is present in each person within the personal history, gifts, and limitations of each individual human being. If you think about the Jesuit tradition of the spiritual exercises, which is usually made available by invitation to those who might be interested, and that their purpose as Jesuits is to find God and to seek God in all things. Well, if that's your motivation, that is going to shape the kind of educational institution that you found, especially since you can't found the institution by yourself. So Xavier only got to Japan, but wasn't able to found the university. Your founding documents say that those who met him met a man who was very open to other cultures and extremely respectful of Japanese culture and had this desire to found a university there. And it may have taken another 400 years. But by the time Father Hoffman comes as a German, he, according to your website, he set about trying to learn Japanese while teaching German and the German literature and philosophy he loved and knew so well, while trying to find Japanese scholars who would join the project. And then the name, your name is so beautiful. It's not Loyola, it's not Xavier, it's not Tokyo Catholic University, it's wisdom, seat of wisdom. You say it means that wisdom which is expressed in ethical activities that further the goals of human existence. This is a way of seeking and finding God in all things. In Jewish scriptures, wisdom is one name for the divine spirit of God permeating all creation. And in your long-range plan, you say so clearly, you do what the church in Vatican II would say is read the signs of the times, that you're standing on the threshold of your 101st year when your birth rate is in decline in Japan, aging population is on the rise, globalization and information technology development bringing about huge changes, and then the terrible earthquake and tsunami. That's your setting. And you say because of that, you're going to focus on global problems of poverty, environment, education, ethical commitment. And this is very much in keeping with that Jesuit impulse. So whenever I read those kinds of statements, I always assume that they are probably the product of committees that discuss them, and there was probably contentious discussion, and this word must go, and that word can come back. And then even beyond that, and then it has to get vetted through layers of authority and tested on, different, we would say, stakeholders. But you come up with saying that your values, your Christian values, are evangelical justice and the truth that sets us free. And what I'm saying to you is there must be reasons of Japanese history, culture, that made you name those as your formulation of your Jesuit heritage. There must be. And I know it's in translation, that adds another layer, but I'm assuming there's an overlapping consensus there. And I think that I could give you a similar story about Georgetown's founding. You know, we have a very different founding in the sense that Sophia is an effort to insert a university in a society with a very long history and culture, identity. But Georgetown begins when 13 colonies that were founded for different purposes decided to see if they could form a republic, and were very self-conscious about doing that. We are going to make this experiment. And the founder, John Carroll, happened to be a Catholic who belonged to a colony that was started by Catholics because they were being persecuted back home in Britain. But other colonies had been founded by other religious groups that had been persecuted back home. And others were founded to make money and to have aristocracies and to deal with prisoners. I mean, it was a mixed bag of the 13 colonies. But when they decided to become a republic, they decided from their history that there would be separation of church and state and yet freedom of religion. And in that mix, John Carroll wants to found an institution that can come up with citizens for that republic. And that's our founding story. And we are still working on the challenges of religious pluralism today. You know, we're still working hard on that. You can see our Center for Muslim and Christian Understanding, the Berkeley Center. We have campus ministry here that happen to include an imam and a rabbi and a woman rabbi. You know, we have representatives of different religions. We think international relations needs to teach about the role of religions in world politics, both as maybe sources of potential conflict or peaceable outcomes. So we're still living our founding story, but we're naming the challenges differently for the 21st century. You said that you want to focus at Sophia on fighting the discrimination that associated with nationality, age, and gender. And I was very struck by that. And it made me realize that in the United States, we would add race because of our history with slavery. And we would add religion because of our interreligious, plural, polity. So I think we can learn a lot from the founding stories of each university. And I think there's an interplay between that founding and the charism of the society that founded both. Now, so I hope maybe someday, when you're thinking about the research that's going to come out of celebrating the 100 years, that maybe someone will try to write a story about what the role of Sophia Jochi Daigaku has been for Catholic life in Japan. You know, what Sophia has taught the Catholic Church. And I can give you an example of the kind of an analogous situation from Georgetown in a Jesuit named John Courtney Murray, who grew up in American society, and he's Catholic, and he's beginning to realize that in his time, Catholic communities seemed to flourish in the United States, and he began to think it was exactly because there was no state religion, that there was freedom of religion, separation of church and state. Becomes a theologian. His study of theology is informed by his experience of American culture, and he ends up being a main drafter of the document on religious freedom that the Catholic Church accepts in Vatican II, and that greatly changes the Church's understanding of religious freedom. Yeah. Culture, teaching church, church teaching culture, mediated through the charism of the Jesuits. So what I think would be fun is you have an amazing opportunity of Sophia. You know, when I was reading your website, I noticed you had a visit from Pope John Paul II. I don't know that Georgetown's ever had a pope come visit. And you had a visit from Mother Teresa. I don't think Georgetown ever had Mother Teresa come visit. You know, so
You're the historian.
I don't know. But I will say this. You have an amazing story with regard to Pedro Arrupe, who wasn't directly connected with Sophia, and Adolfo Nicolas. Just think about this. You know, both of those Spaniards, so we're back to Spaniards again. You know, we started with Xavier and Ignatius, then we skipped to a German, Father Hoffman, you know, and we're back to the Spaniards, went young and immersed themselves in Japanese culture and history. So you have gone to universities that have been intrinsically international from their foundings. That has to affect the kinds of education that you're receiving. How could it not? Then Pedro Arrupe lives through the dropping of a nuclear weapon on Nagasaki. I think he has a lot to teach the Church and the Society of Jesus when he becomes a superior general. Meanwhile, you have Adolfo Nicolas going to Japan when he's 24 years old. If I thought 35 was young, I think 24 is young. He did his first study of theology in Sophia. Once again, I assume that has to have shaped his understanding of theology. And when he goes to get his PhD at the Pontifical Gregorian in Rome, he's already bringing with him his theological formation within Japan. He teaches at your university for decades. He works with refugees in the field, poorer members of the community. He is the head of the East Asian Pastoral Institute in Ateneo in Manila. Now he's the Superior General of the Jesuits. And we've all been quoting from what he says Catholic and Jesuit education should do. Where did he learn it? He had to have learned it in that dialogue between what Sophia is and what Jesuit charism is that he lived. And now he's the Superior General of the Jesuits, and in this moment of the Jesuits, we now have a Jesuit Pope who said that he thinks Father Nicolas is still his superior. You know, he said that, I think, a little bit lightheartedly on the last feast day of the Jesuits. You know, so I think it can be useful to think through the ways in which a founding impulse can shape a Catholic and Jesuit university, and then the way the history of that Jesuit and Catholic university in its own context, its own times, its own culture, can then turn and influence the religious order. And those were the comments I wanted to make.
Thank you.
Okay.
So in the spirit of dialogue, I want to jump directly to questions from the audience, but I thought I would try to summarize what I think are some of the most fascinating points that have been addressed that we may or may not want to take up in the wider conversation. I'll start with Marilyn, and I really appreciate, and it's very appropriate on a centenary occasion like this, to reflect on history and to make the case that history matters for institutions, that there's something about the identity of a Sophia and of a Georgetown linked back to our history. It's a bit of a counterintuitive argument in this era of globalization where we feel like we're racing forward, where technology is driving so many changes, where people's memories and maybe institutions' memories are not as robust. So we might want to reflect a little bit on that, on the specificity of our identities, what makes us distinctive, and how it is rooted in our similar but also different histories. Then to move to the interesting discussion imparted by Kevin's remarks, and in a way continued by Kosaku. Kevin perhaps a little more upbeat in drawing on the legacy of an influential Japanese thinker to make the argument that there is something like a global culture, that it is partly to be arrived at through dialogue, but also involves a lot of work within traditions to approach something like natural law, a shared understanding of human dignity. And the case that the humanities and the study of the humanities today is a critical way to deepen that sensitivity to the existence of this global culture, to encourage students to participate in that global culture. Kosaku, a little bit pessimistic on how that sense of the global is being achieved, might be achieved through cultural exchange. Maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but you at least pointed out how difficult it is to really gain an appreciation of another culture. It's not a matter of a one-off connection. As we think about exchange programs and collaboration, we need to give students and faculty opportunities to deepen partnerships over many years. And you have this fascinating idea of the importance of a three-way comparison, which I think is a good reminder to us as we're so focused on the US-Japanese relationship and on our two institutions, on the importance of that triangulation for truly better understanding different countries and appreciating cultural differences. And then Taro, I thought your discussion of a concrete example of teaching human development and how that can contribute to better cultural understanding was critical, because it brought us back to the classroom, to the practice of teaching, and raised the possibility that exchange and collaboration across institutions might not just involve talk and discussion, but joint action oriented toward real problems, particularly problems in the developing world, which, again, to come back to the identity of our institutions, is part and parcel of the idea in the Jesuit order of higher education in service to the wider world. So I know we could just continue the conversation up here. There's a lot more that was addressed, but I want to take the last half hour of our time together to open it up, especially to our students, to encourage you to ask questions, but also make comments, and perhaps there are issues that haven't been addressed that you'd like to bring up as well. We've got 2 microphones, I think, and I will direct the microphones to you. I'd ask you to stand up and briefly introduce yourself and pose a question or make a comment. I will not have all of the speakers respond to every comment or question, but we can sort of divide things up as we go along. So who wants to get us started? We have a hand up here.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Horikoshi. I'm a sophomore studying international health at Georgetown University. And I'm very interested in learning more about developing countries and the education systems there. But I feel like I don't share that sentiment with a lot of my peers. I just was looking at the list of the most popular study abroad destinations for Georgetown students, and it's pretty much all developed countries like Spain, United Kingdom, France, and hosts of other countries. So what are some of the ways that you anticipate promoting students, I guess, studying abroad in developing countries or eventually working in them?
Let's hear who'd like to speak to that. Marilyn, want to start? Yep.
I'm always encouraging students in international relations to take the risk, to go beyond their comfort zone. I love the students who have a proficiency in French, who choose to go to Senegal rather than Paris. They often stop in Paris on the way, and one should, But I do think that we've had students, nursing and health studies has led the way in a lot of this. People working in Ghana, Tanzania, and doing both a research project, taking some classes, and doing actual service in a clinic. So I'm with you in trying to support our students in doing that.
Yes, it's interesting to hear you saying that, because it seems like the problem is similar in the States and Japan, that many students, as the professor pointed out, a bit more like inward-looking, interested in domestic issues more than the international issues. The part of the reasons why some students, at least in my class, may not be so interested in education in developing nations as much as education in Japan or developed nations, is that it might be difficult for them to see the career path. If we learn about education in developing nations, what can I do with that knowledge and skills? And so in my class, in fact, that's what I'm thinking about for next semester, that I'll be teaching a class, second-year students class next semester, but I would like to have one sort of session solely focusing on possible career paths so that students can visualize what they can do after they learn about education in developing nations.
As a practical tip, I might suggest that you start by learning a language first, because if you know the language, you want to go to the country and learn its culture. And I'm a little worried about English language imperialism, and I advocate multilingualism. And unfortunately, Japan and the United States are two of the most monolingual countries in the world. そう思いませんか? So I would like Georgetown students to, speak at least 2 or 3 languages, and I would like to say the same thing for Sophian students.
Let me add briefly, when Mother Teresa didn't come here, but went to Harvard, an American ran up there and said, "Oh, I want to do what you do. I want to work with the poorest of the poor. Oh, you're a saint." And she said, "I've seen more poverty in this country than I've seen in India." In other words, I would challenge you to think more broadly about what true poverty is. Sometimes, even in spite of Georgetown and probably Sophia's Catholic background, we tend to adopt a notion of poverty that Marxists and materialists accept. I worry more about the people who go to Europe and Japan and don't see the poverty. And I think that could be one of our missions, is to try to address the kinds of spiritual poverty that these elite, advanced, developed countries have. And when you do go to developing countries, you often find that they have a richness of spiritual life that we don't have. So I would encourage you to challenge your classmates and say, "Oh, so you're going to France. You'll find a lot of poverty there." And tell them they need to work on helping address the spiritual poverty in these otherwise rich countries.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your discussion. And I'm you from Sophia University, and I majored in area studies on North Africa. And I have a question, and it's nothing about my major, but how do you think if we should establish a different evaluation system for the abroad students? Because in Japan, when the foreign students come, they went to the language school for 1 or 2 years, and they enter the university. Perhaps they should pay a lot for the language school. So perhaps there is the same problem for the Japanese student, for them to come and go out of their country. So if we have a evaluation system for the foreign student, perhaps I think it will be easier for the Japanese students to go to the English-speaking countries, and also for the American students to go to the developing countries. So how do you think about that? Thank you.
Maybe I'll say a little bit about that. This is a very hot topic, and certainly in American higher education, is how you integrate, or a term that's used is sometimes articulate, that experience abroad with the wider curriculum. And you do it in a way that captures the experience, that evaluates the experience, but also links it back to the student's major, areas of interest, and so on. One philosophical debate we have here at Georgetown, and we have around the world, is whether study abroad should be essentially reproducing the curriculum at the home institution in another country, making sure that you have access to the science courses and whatnot you might have at home, and doing that in a way that's culturally immersive, so that you're there and have that experience, that deep experience. Another way of thinking about it is that you're going abroad to learn about the country, to learn the language, and that, if that's the approach, the main purpose, then the preparation will be different and the evaluation will be different as well. And in practice, universities like Georgetown, and Kathy Bellows is here from the Office of International Programs and could go into more detail, but we have a range of options for students, and we're trying to get our faculty more focused on the real educational stakes in play in these decisions as more and more of our students seek out these international experiences.
Hiroaki from the United Nations. I'd like to add the one dimension to the question raised on the value of studying in developing countries, for instance. If you're interested in joining the UN, up to the age 32, we have a competitive examination. The second part of that examination is oral interviews. We ask applicants what they have done rather than what they wish to do. We call it competency-based interviews. So, for instance, if you say, I have studied this or that at Georgetown, Sophia, that really doesn't answer questions as to what you have done in your life to deal with interpersonal relations, conflicts, the teamwork. What kind of experience do you have with teamwork, in teamwork, that kind of thing. So if you happen to, let's say, study in a developing country, education system, poverty, you can talk about those things as part of your experience. And we find that kind of experience very, very useful in working in international organizations because a large part of the UN resources actually is devoted to developing countries. About 70% of the UN resources actually are used in the economic, social, human rights, and other field. We tend to talk about political conflicts and peacekeeping, but again, the large part of our work is geared towards helping developing countries, dealing with, overcoming poverty, spreading primary education throughout the world, helping maternity, health, inoculating children against diseases and so forth. So I would like just to add that students, particularly young people having experience working in developed countries, actually have enormous value for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right here.
Hi, I'm Greg Arrett from the Department of State, and I thought since Moriwaki-san just made a very good pitch for the UN, I might as well talk about the United States Foreign Service, where, Lindsay, if you're interested in going abroad and living abroad in a developing country, I actually joined the Foreign Service as a Japanese language speaker. However, my first posting was in Haiti, where I worked in Haiti as a visa officer for 2 years. And my second posting was New Delhi. Only now, in the Office of Japan Affairs, where I currently work, do I now have the chance to put my Japanese language to use. But I wanted to just make a quick point about U.S.-Japan educational exchanges, since it was brought up by the first two speakers. And I thank them for bringing up what, for us, is a very critical issue, which is the declining numbers of Japanese students going abroad, particularly here to the United States. And I do want to thank Professor Doak for raising the findings of the educational task force that was set up between the governments of both countries, and the results of which were received by Prime Minister Abe himself, who I think, and we're on the US government side very appreciative, recognizes the challenges of English language ability by Japanese students and international experience to Japan's overall competitiveness. I just wanted to mention or underscore really what Professor Doak said, which is that both countries are taking this very seriously, and in fact, perhaps the silver lining in the dark cloud of the declining numbers of students coming from Japan to the United States in particular is that it's catalyzed action by both governments to really focus in on this issue. And in fact, anecdotally, we are seeing, after a steady decline, an uptick this year in the number of student visa applications from Japan to the United States.
Let me take this opportunity to turn it around and maybe ask some of our visiting students from Sophia what they think of this trend. Is it something you've encountered in conversations with colleagues, less of a willingness to study abroad? Are you surprised to hear about these studies and these statistics? And more generally, are you optimistic or pessimistic about a more international orientation of young people in Japan? So let's hear from 2 or 3 of our Sophia colleagues. Please stand up. Yeah. I think it's on.
Okay, hello. My name is Maiko Oka, and I'm a sophomore studying in the Department of English Studies in Sophia University. I myself feel that, well, in my department, there are many students who study abroad because it's an English department, but I actually saw, I've heard that the number is declining also in our department, and, well, my other friends in, like, the other departments, I also feel that, well, most people are not interested in going abroad, like studying abroad. So I actually felt that there's a trend that not promoting like the exchange students, but the students themselves are inward looking from my perspective too. And well, I understand that the university is trying to find methods like making courses as human dignity in English, but may have some advice for what maybe we ourselves as students can do to turn over that trend and increase more students that will be interested in studying abroad.
Tom,
Yes,
can I ask?
please, yeah.
You know, our university, and for that matter, many Japanese universities are promoting globalization. And younger people are not really interested in studying abroad or globalization. So what can we do as university professors? What can we do for you to become more engaged with international activities?
Let's bring the mic up. Keep it here within the Sophia student delegation, yeah. And maybe another colleague too could speak to this. Yeah.
Well, for myself, I'm very interested in studying abroad, and also I've been taking courses that has been having a debate on the benefits of studying abroad. And I personally believe that the best way to cultivate global minds is to actually go and visit other countries and experience it with their own eyes. So I thought that maybe courses that will allow students to think more about the benefits of going abroad may be one of the ways to increase students.
Okay. Any other? Yes, please. What would you add? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Satsuki Seijima, and I'm a sophomore for international law. I have a little opinion, and my friends around me they're pretty much interested in studying abroad, but they get I don't know, but they hesitated because of the money. And also in the law faculty, the study is so hard because the word is so hard in low words and stuff, so they kind of hesitate going abroad, and they also have a hard time getting credits in Japan. So I think that's the hard part of going abroad. And to overcome those difficulties, I was thinking of a class that can get us to communicate with the foreign students coming to Japan, because I see a lot of foreign students in Sophia University, but I kind of feel like they're all cuddled up together, only with the foreign students, and I think they don't have so much time to speak to Japanese students. So maybe if we have a class once a week or even twice a week, so that we can speak in English and they can speak in Japanese, or maybe have a different times. So maybe if we have a class like that, it will be more easier for us to think about studying abroad or things like that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And let me just iterate, and then why don't you take the mic? But I just wanted to add that these are things we're wrestling with here at Georgetown as well. You know, the cost of studying abroad, concern about the recognition of credits, which is not the faculty as much as it is perhaps the administration, needing to adapt to this new world. And also, as you mentioned, the integration of foreign students who are here at Georgetown. About 13% of our students, graduates, and undergraduates hail from around the world, and we don't do a good enough job of learning from them while they're here. So those are challenges we're facing as well. Yes? Do you have the mic? Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm Minai Ikari. I'm a junior in law. I've worked a little bit at the open campus in Sophia University this year, and I have been talking to girls about 16, 17 who wanted to enter Sophia University. And when I talked with them, many of the girls first asked me if it would be a plus for them finding career if they entered the law department. And I was very surprised because that wasn't a question that was asking about what I was doing in the university. They were trying to look for ties with companies. And what I thought was that career finding is very severe in Japan right now. And I feel as that going abroad is a little bit time consuming, and a lot of people who go abroad needs more time in university. Many students remain in university for 5 years compared to students who doesn't remain 4 years in the university and find it difficult to find careers. So as Professor Komatsu said before, I think there should be more career options or maybe opportunities for people who go abroad, and that might promote people to go abroad. Thank you very much.
Kevin, this also raises the issue of the liberal arts and some of the pressures that the liberal arts are under, given the very real financial constraints families are facing, the trends toward greater focus on vocational and professional education. How should the liberal arts respond? People in your department and other humanities departments, is this an opportunity to make the case that that's also the key to education in this global era?
It's easy to say what we shouldn't do. Yeah. We shouldn't give up on the liberal arts and go with a kind of utilitarian, pragmatic, job-oriented curriculum. I think the problems are different for Japan students and American students. One of the problems for American students is they need more foreign language training. The problem I understand in Japan is that the companies don't always appreciate foreign language skills. It's kind of just the opposite. The good news that I'm bringing, because maybe you're right, I'm in a more optimistic mood than some other people, perhaps. The good news I'm bringing is that the Colcom report, which you just heard has reached the Prime Minister of Japan's hands, has identified many of the complaints you've raised and has proposed some solutions to them if possible. So I think what we're going to be seeing, and I'm sorry to say perhaps a little too late for you, but maybe in the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, we will be seeing some concerted efforts by the Japanese public-private sector and the American public-private sector to address some of these problems for overseas students, levels of language required, credit transfers, getting companies to appreciate the role of overseas studies. I will end on this more general optimistic note that I hope has some bearing for the Japanese students too. About 6 or 7 years ago, here at Georgetown, the dean of the college invited her board of visitors to a meeting, and they wanted to talk to the chairs of some of the language programs. So I was the chair of the East Asian language program at the time, and I went and I met them. And to a person, there's about 40 of them there, all very accessible executives. To a person, they said they would rather hire a foreign language major than a business major, which is a very interesting point. And their reasoning was almost uniform as well, which was all businesses are global now, and they don't have time to teach a student a foreign language. But what they need to know in their business capacity changes so quickly that they have to train them in business. So I would encourage you to go ahead with your foreign language skills, continue to develop them. As my colleague Professor Yoshino said, get a second language, a third language, a fourth language if you can, and wait it out and see what happens. But I think the best education for a job is good reading and writing skills in a foreign language. And that's what we do in the liberal arts.
Yes, please.
Just wanted to point out sort of critical importance of staying or living abroad, especially for students like Sophia students. Some of you will become the policy leaders in the society. I think it's very important for those young people to have an experience as being a minority in a society. When you go abroad, you're likely to become a minority. You are living in a society where you do not understand the language, or you do not understand customs and cultures and values. And Japan is becoming a multicultural society. It's still not yet, but probably it's going to be more so in the future. And I think it's very important for the future leaders to understand how it feels to be a minority in a society. Just wanted to point it out.
All right, we have time for a couple of more questions, one up here and one back here. Okay.
Hi, I'm Tomoyuki Shikata. I'm a sophomore in the SF School of Foreign Service. And so going back to the the discussion about the inward-looking college students in Japan, I don't necessarily agree about that. So I've been looking up in a newspaper in the 90s. I think it was Yomiuri Shimbun. And they were also saying these days people are inward-looking 20 years ago. So I think it hasn't really changed. And so I would say that compared to other countries in Asia, like Korea or China, we are maybe inward-looking compared to them, but not these days or compared to other eras in Japan. And and I have one question. So I think, in my opinion, liberal arts education in Japan is pretty different from the US. Although we have something called Ippan Kyoyo, I think it is pretty different from the US. I think it is very hard to incorporate the liberal arts education into Japanese system, since it would, of course, we have because we're paying the very expensive tuition. We had those facilities, and we had the small class size system, and I would say that it is very difficult to realize that kind of system in Japan. And so, unlike the U.S. universities, Japanese universities are not hubs for the students around the world right now. And how would you think Japan should change the liberal arts education system to a more attractive system to other foreign students?
Thank you. Maybe what do you think? Yeah.
I was always a popular professor precisely because I was liberal and globally conscious and internationally oriented. Now, I ceased to be a popular one, and I think students are looking for a more conservative and more nationalistic professor. I'm half joking and I'm half serious. Let me give you another episode, which is a very controversial episode. Maybe I shouldn't mention this episode. I was talking with one of my students about what the Japanese did in China, right? And one student said, "Professor, did you witness it?" I wasn't born around that time, so of course I didn't. He said so, and he said, "Why can you, as a sociologist, say that it was the Japanese did it? Maybe they didn't do it." See, that's ignorance. They don't know history. You see, this is what I mean by saying that the Japanese. I'm not saying all the Japanese people. Some sections of the Japanese youth have become very conservative, inward-looking, and nationalistic, and I'm very worried about that. And this change came about very, very recently, a year ago or 2 years ago. 3 years ago, things were very different. Maybe when you left Japan, it was 3 years ago, wasn't it? Yeah.
Let me simply follow up and add to that, because I think what you're talking about is what we would call general education courses, the first 2 years. And it's a shame in Japan that all too often liberal arts gets relegated to that functional role. If you wanted to have a discussion about general education requirements in universities, we'd have lots of controversy because there's lots of debates in America about the function of a required 2 years of a smattering of courses. I'm more concerned with the deeper question of liberal arts that may go beyond the first 2 years, people who take philosophy, literature, theology, history. And to follow up on what my colleague, Professor Yoshino, was talking about, I think that attitude that he related reflects something that the guy I was quoting, Tanaka Kotaro, said was the biggest problem in modern Japanese intellectual history of the 20th century. That was the dominance of Immanuel Kant's philosophy, which he summarized as subjectivism. Right? So if your understanding of truth follows the dominant Japanese Kantian notion that all truth is subjective, therefore it's experiential. If you haven't experienced it, it has no validity. All you know is what you personally have experienced, and this is connected to the history problem, it's connected to questions about truth, human rights, the dignity of all people, to nationalism, et cetera, et cetera. So I would like to see not simply a curricular reform dealing with the first 2 years of Japanese education, but a deeper understanding that goes to the heart of philosophy, which I think a Catholic university like Sophia and Georgetown have in their traditions, the ability to transcend subjectivist Kantian claims and get at a really good debate over what are the criterion for understanding objective moral truths. That kind of debate, I think, would be wonderful for Japan in terms of moving it towards a more global education.
Thank you. Final question over here.
Hi, my name's Colin Steele, and I'm a graduate of Georgetown and now back here working with Professor Banchoff. And in the interest of time, I'll sort of phrase this more as food for thought. Namely, I think we've identified, principally thanks to Professor Yoshino, the chief pitfall of internationalism, that students may experience a little bit of internationalism as a dangerous thing. Kind of like philosophy, frankly. And also the end, that it seems like everybody in the public sector, the private sector, the governmental sector, and even the educational sector want, which is that sort of deeply ethical, plays well with others kind of a graduate who can travel anywhere, whether within his or her own country or across the globe, and relate well to other people and manage their own reactions to same. And it sounds like that's what the UN wants to hire, that's what business wants to hire, that's what the State Department would like. It's the kind of person that liberal education seeks to create. The question is, how do we intentionally get there? It sounds like we need to send students abroad, but how do we bring them back and make sense of what they've seen and done? And how do we start doing things intentionally within the university such that the goal is 4 years from now, you're going to leave here, and we can choose any sort of a role model, be it Xavier or whomever, such that we do lean towards sending people abroad as a Xavier or an Ignatius or whomever, rather than either just an ignorant person who wants to stay home, wow, that world is big and scary, or Commodore Perry who says, I'm just going to go over there and open the door and nail it wide open.
Thank you, Colin, and that's a useful summary of many of the things we discussed and some of the challenges we face going forward. We've now run out of time for this particular panel. It's been a wonderful, wide-ranging discussion, and I hope we can continue it informally, for example, over the coffee break that lies before us. And I invite you to return for a fascinating discussion of technology and innovation in the Asia-Pacific at 3 o'clock. Finally, in conclusion, please join me in thanking our panel for a wonderful discussion.